So good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending where you are. I'm really delighted to welcome you all to the final session from Rebellious Research Seminar Series Round 2. Just a quick reminder, it's a monthly seminar on practice research in different creative disciplines. And every month we have some amazing speakers joining and talking for about an hour about what they do and how practice research can be supported, and that's followed with by half an hour Q&A. And then all the sessions are recorded, published on YouTube, and available for everyone to see. So today, I'm really pleased to have Paul Ottey with us. Paul was about to give his talk last year, actually, with Fiona Graham, who was the original person who was meant to deliver this talk with Paul. So I'm very glad we finally can do it. Thank you so much, Paul. And the title today's presentation is An Examination of a Multi-Component Output Portfolio for Rev 2021, Deborah, the World War I Tank, French and British community-focused narrative. So I'm just gonna stop sharing my screen and pass it on to you, Paul. And if you don't mind just introducing yourself briefly, and then obviously the next hour is yours.
Absolutely not a problem. Okay, so hopefully you can see a screen.
Sorry, yes.
Excellent. Cool. So, yeah, this talk, as Agatha mentioned, was originally going to be delivered by Fiona and myself because we collaborate a huge amount on the research and the work that we do. So I'm going to very ineptly fill Fiona's shoes and sort of talk about her parts of this sort of project as well, and the sort of collaborations and stuff that sort of come across from it. And really what we tried to kind of build in the university, which you can see on that front page there, we titled it sort of Production House, and it's this idea of kind of formalizing a lot of the things that we were doing in a lot of different and disparate ways across our own kind of work in terms of sort of research and practice. We're both practitioners, so both have a kind of background in sort of creating film, documentary in particular, a lot of factual work, but we come at it from two quite different directions. So as a kind of brief introduction to ourselves, Fiona's background sort of started in journalism. So she actually started in print journalism, newspapers, moved on to radio, and then into sort of television and film production after that. So her kind of angle's always been the kind of writing and storytelling, the sort of structuring of things. My career path was a slightly odd one because I actually started out as an engineer. So I come from a very technical background. And it's a discussion I have with Agatha a lot, is I still don't think I'm a creative person, but we argue quite a lot about it. So I work in sort of creative fields now, but with that kind of camera, sound, drone technology, moving a lot into sort of virtual technologies and things as well. So we'll see some of the stuff that we're working towards on the end of these projects. So there's going to be a little bit of time jumping around throughout this session to tell a story, much like a Marvel film. We've got sort of multiple timelines that are running together, so I'll try and make sense of all of those. But Fiona and myself first met a number of years ago when we started work at Staffordshire Uni. Oh, there is no Fiona. I've just seen that comment pop up. I am literally replacing Fiona, I'm afraid to say, for today. So you only get to look at me. And yeah, so we met each other when we started work at the university. We've both come in from this practice-based background. But as we started to talk and we started to discuss things, we started to realise that we had a lot of very similar interests in terms of what we did as well. We love the factual filmmaking, we love history, we love all of these kind of aspects. So we started talking about a lot of these things together. Neither of us had a background in kind of research and the sort of traditional path of going through research aspects. Neither of us have got the sort of PhD route as we went in. So we always had that challenge of what is it that we're actually doing that fits into this idea of research. And thank God now is we've got this real kind of push towards the idea of practice-based research. So we found a lot of places that our work could go. And this really built up to this idea of how do we share these pieces of work, which built up to the portfolio of sort of outputs that come across these projects. I'm actually going to talk a little bit about three projects. So the main kind of focus is the sort of Tank Deborah and how that kind of built a lot of these ideas and how we built communities and how Fiona and myself worked together. But there's also two other projects that are really important that kind of fit into this. One of those, which is the project that really originated the kind of ideas for what Production House would become. And then one of them is a sort of later project where we started to apply a lot of the work that we'd actually done. We always, if we ever do a talk about these subjects, we always start by telling people we are not historians. So we think that's really, really important to kind of understand that. We're not coming in to these projects from the point of view of historians. We're coming from these projects from the point of view of storytelling. And a lot of it is about discovering stories. And I think that's a really important part of what we do throughout these projects, is we don't try and define a story. We don't come in and try and research the history aspects. We look at what's happening sort of now in a lot of these historical events. And you see a lot of that through the community and the sort of place aspects that come from the work we do. So it's really important to keep that in mind, that we're not actually historians. I'm afraid to say I've been talking in an air-conditioned room all day, so I'll be pausing for drinks every so often. So this is where I jump forward a little bit in time. And quite a number of years after Fiona and I started working together on projects outside, on commercial projects, broadcast projects, there was an opportunity to get involved with a high funding for trying to build a link between research and dissemination of research. So this idea of taking out the traditional kind of published research routes and thinking very much about how academic research works with traditional broadcast, traditional methods of sort of outputs. And again, I think it's really interesting, this idea of multi-mode, multi-component outputs that we're starting to talk about. And it's really nice that Agatha's going to sort of bring a lot of those in through these as well, because although Fiona and myself are fundamentally filmmakers, is we do try and get involved with or find all sorts of other outputs that come from these projects and to sort of share these. And I know the particular project that was worked on with the high funding was actually around Holocaust project. So the link between what we were doing and what the researchers were doing was about finding ways of sort of telling and sharing these stories in accessible ways. We need to perform a function for these other researchers. So what we did is we started to collaborate with the archaeology department at Staffordshire Uni, and they've got a very, very strong sort of Holocaust research background. So it was looking at this idea of how can we attach, you know, academics to our research to build, again, this collaborative process where we're creating outputs that suit public dissemination a lot more strongly, but also maintain the kind of academic-led part of the narratives. That was really, really important to sort of keep that in there, because anyone who's ever worked in kind of broadcasting or with those areas, you're probably aware that sometimes they will try and spin or change or move or tell slightly different stories to the ones that are actually happening or they're actually there. And so it's making sure that that academic kind of rigor is maintained through those processes. So that was actually a really big project. We visited Poland twice to go out and do a whole range of research, and it linked up with a whole range of other areas as well. There was a load of laser scanning, there was historical sort of archive material, there was community research projects going on throughout all of this. So for myself, we're looking at all these things and looking at all these links, and how sometimes these things weren't always sort of connected. So a big part of it was trying to bring in how these ideas were actually sort of connected and linked together. And that was really the kind of first thing when we started to look at the idea of what Production House could be, or what it should be, or what it would end up actually becoming. So like I said, that's a jump forward in time. So this is one of the later projects we actually worked on. So there is now a time jump where we go backwards in time. I couldn't do the wobbly screen effect, so that's the best we're going to get, I'm afraid, from PowerPoint. So not long after I first met Fiona, so this is jumping back in time a little bit now, she said to me, I know a Frenchman who has a tank in a barn. And I wasn't entirely sure what to make of that at that point. I think we both knew that we were into history at that point. Wasn't quite sure what to make of this. What do you mean by a tank? An oil tank, a water tank? What do you actually mean? So as any good researcher does, is you start asking questions. What are you talking about? So she started to explain this story of a chap called Philippe Grzinski in Flequier in northern France. who again wasn't a historian. A lot of the people that we work with, interestingly, aren't historians. They are just passionate people who get involved with these stories. So again, that our kind of role in this is to bring all those different stories together to become, a package of research, a package of materials. Such as I know a Frenchman who has a tank in a barn. Now, there should be some video playing back there. I never like doing video on Teams. These are all available. Anything that I show here is available through some links that I've got at the end of this. So it's worth looking back at those to see what's going on. But these little set of clips show you the sort of town of Flequier, the battlefields, the sort of location and the place where all of these things were happening. And Philippe Gozinski, who you saw talking on screen there a moment ago, was just a local. He grew up in the area. He built a fascination with World War I and tanks because, as a kid, who wouldn't? He's running around on all these battlefields, picking phosphorus grenades out of the side of the road and throwing them down wells and all the sorts of things that young boys would do at that sort of period. He became a hotel owner, so he runs a hotel in the local town. And through his kind of work, he actually started to hear a story about a World War I tank that was buried just outside this small village of Flequier. And there he is, sat on top of his tank, literally in a barn. Absolutely amazing to go and see that. So yeah, many years ago when I first met Fiona, we went across and we saw this tank in a barn, and Philippe drove us across all the fields and gave us all this kind of amazing background on these stories. And it wasn't until much later that we actually started to work on this as a proper project. So the way that actually worked out is the Hive-funded project, the Holocaust project in Poland. We travelled across with kit and with crew to go and film that entire project. And one of the stop-offs we decided to do was in Flequier, near Flequier in Cambrai, to go and visit with Philippe, just as a kind of rest break before we did the final trip back to England. And we sat there and we thought, we've got a load of film kit sitting in the vehicle here, and we've got a bit of time left. So let's go and start working on this as a project as well and figuring out what the actual story is. And I think this may be the rebellious bit, is we didn't go into this project with a plan. This was a voyage of discovery, which I think is really nice. We knew a lot about Philippe, we knew a lot about the tank. I'd visited myself about 5 or 6 times by this point. Fiona had been for many years. And over that period of time, with Fiona's journalistic background, she'd been writing articles, writing stories for sort of publication about these stories. And then we started to think, well, we need to make this a bit more of a project. We need to formalize it, and we need to find out what it is that we can actually do around these sort of stories. And what a lot of it came up about was actually the kind of communities and the kind of stories that came up through this. But to give a little bit of context to the tank, because I think it needs that, the tank is actually a really important part of the outcome from this as a character. Although it's a big inanimate metal object, it is a significant character throughout these sort of stories. So World War I was the first use of tanks in warfare. We didn't have them before, they didn't exist. I cannot even imagine the first soldier seeing a tank rolling across the field towards them, what they must have thought. When they see these 20-ton tanks rolling across at them. They're terrifying things. So they didn't really know how to fight in these things. They didn't know how they worked. And the Battle of Cambrai, the Second Battle of Cambrai, was the first time where they actually used infantry, tanks, and aircraft all as a combined force. Previous to that, they've been using them all separately, and the tanks had never been 100% successful. They weren't reliable. They were unpleasant to be into the extreme, where people had to jump out of their tanks in the middle of a battlefield because the fumes inside meant they couldn't breathe if they're inside the tank. There's a lot of things that sort of fold off from this, and you can probably see, hopefully, on that picture, the tank is called Hyacinth in that particular picture, which is an interesting part of the characterization of these objects in the sort of story. Philippe's tank was called Deborah D51, and Philippe always described it as his other woman to his wife. I'm not sure if his wife was the second or the tank was the first. I'm not sure about that, but it was always his other woman. And the reason that they sort of built these, the tank regiments were divided up by letter. So you had D, you had E, you had all these different tank regiments, and the tank crews themselves could choose what they called their tank based on that letter. So you had a lot of named after people. You had Hyacinth, you had Deborah, you had tanks called Egypt, you had all these different tanks. You actually had a tank in F Battalion called Fray Bentos, which was, you know, the kind of humour of these people in these tanks. So Tank Deborah was a really, really interesting sort of part of the story, because Tank Deborah was actually the most successful tank in that Battle of Cambrai. And the reason it was the most successful is because it got the furthest through to its objectives on the actual day of the battle. But it was still destroyed in that particular battle. So Philippe himself had heard the rumours about this tank that existed, and he started to go and do his research, and he hunted it down, and he got the Royal Tank Regiment involved, and he found out that this tank was actually buried in the small town of Flequier. Tank Deborah D51 is the tank that's on the right hand side there. Nobody knew that that was Tank Deborah D51 until this work had started, until people started to look at the links and figure out the archive. IWM has a great archive for these things. And they discovered that that tank in the picture there was Deborah D51. It was destroyed in the battle. 5 of the crew members were killed at that point, and they are buried right next to where that tank was destroyed. So again, we started to look from our point of view, from Fiona and my point of view, we started to look at all of these connections, all of these links between the people, the place, and the communities that existed around this area. And really fascinating the sort of idea of the fact this town was destroyed pretty much back in World War One, but it's there again. They rebuilt, they put all these things back together. Let me skip on very quickly. So Philippe, with the tank in his barn, is absolutely passionate about the story of the tank and the story of the crew that are in there. But the community started to build up this same passion as well. And Fiona and myself started to build up this same passion. And we met a chap called Jacques, and Jacques is literally the most incredible archivist of the most specific information you could ever imagine. He goes out in Flequier and records everything that happens on his video camera. He is absolutely 100% involved in all of these things. And when they found Tank Deborah, as you saw probably from the footage there, he was there with his VHS camera capturing absolutely everything. So he created this incredible archive of material over this period of time. It started to become newsworthy. Sky News, I know, came out and did a lot of work around this area as well. But finding these people that lived in this village was a key part of the story. And they started to sort of develop this idea of ownership of this story of this tank. This is Tank Deborah, this is our tank. We love this tank. And as Philippe pulled the tank up out of the ground, they figured out they had to put it somewhere. I don't think he planned that far ahead. What they discovered was the tank had actually been dragged after the war to a big bunker over on the other side of the village that had just been dug. And they had to figure out, well, where are we going to put all this stuff? What are we going to use to fill this hole? So they just dragged the tank all the way across the village, dumped it in there, and then forgot about it for years and years and years. Through his work, the Royal Tank Regiment, air surveys, Philip found the tank. And what he did is he wanted to get it back close to where it's destroyed and close to where the crew were, because this tank belongs to those men that died in the tank. He wanted it to be back there. It started off and the tank was placed in the mayor's garden, where it stayed for 2 years, covered with tarpaulin, while they tried to figure out what they could actually do with this tank. And I think Philip was incredible in this because he funded all the support of this tank himself for 20 years. He actually bought a barn in the village and he took the tank, moved the tank into that barn, and he actually convinced the Royal Engineers to come and move the tank for him. So they picked the tank up out of the mayor's front yard and they took it into this barn and they placed it in there. And this really is where the story started with Fiona and myself, as we started to visit, we started to meet people, we started to understand the sort of idea of ownership of this tank within this village, and started to sort of think, well, what stories can we tell? Whose stories are there to actually tell? And we thought Philippe's was obviously a fascinating story about what's here. And we wanted to avoid telling the story of the tank. There's a lot of that material out there already. We wanted to figure out what was happening now in this village, because we're 100 years after. And I think people have different perspective on these places. If we're British and our relatives fought and died in that country. We have a very different relationship to the people who actually live there. We'll see a little bit of that more in one of the other projects with Hawthorne Ridge. But we knew for a fact the villagers here in this village were passionate about their tank. It was literally something they really cared about. And it was a throwaway comment, and it's what we thought this is the key part of the sort of project and how we sort of share this with people. And Philippe described it as the friend-making machine. And we just thought that's absolutely brilliant. There are so many people that we've met and we've discovered and we've built this community with over a period of time that tank, after being a sort of machine of war for so many years, suddenly we've flipped all that back around now, and it's about rebuilding communities and putting communities back together again. And so that was a fascinating kind of idea of what this tank actually became and what this tank was capable of. We always remember that these things had a serious impact in that sort of time period, and this is the sort of crew of Tank Deborah that were killed in that sort of final battle. Sort of George Foote, William Galway, William Robinson, Joseph Chevington, and Frederick Tipping were the soldiers that died there. And originally nobody knew that they were specifically in that tank. That story had to be built again from building this idea of research and building this idea of who's in the graveyard, who could possibly be in that tank, because sometimes the records weren't particularly good at that time. Tank crews would change. Quite often, the way that a tank crew was built is the tank commander would come into a field and he'd go, "Do you know how to fix engines? Yeah, great, you're in a tank crew now." And that was how they built these crews up. So they weren't always built from the idea of training originally in England and coming over. They were built very much from who's available at any given time. And again, that's a really fascinating aspect of how the tank regiment itself still operates. They say that the tank crews are some of the most close-knit groups of soldiers that you can find, because their entire time fighting in battle is in this tiny little confined space. So again, they have to become incredibly close and incredibly good friends to be able to do that. And again, through the work, staying Philippe's hotels were there, the tank regiment stay there. So our evenings were spent socialising with 4-star generals from the tank regiment, which was incredible. Again, building up that community, that sort of idea of people. And our discovery then was, what is it that they want from the kind of work that we're doing? So in a way, we're still not trying to impose ourselves on these stories, on these ideas. We're trying to find out, what is it that the community wants? What is it the community needs? How do we integrate into these different communities and work in different ways? And again, anyone who's worked in France will know that you have to make friends with the mayor. Straight away, you want anything done in any town in France, make friends with the mayor. That kind of community, that socializing thing is absolutely key and fundamental as we look through these things. So that built up that idea of the sort of French connection, of how will these different communities and these different groups work together. And some of the really fascinating stuff that comes up with some of these historical projects is the idea of these associations that sort of build now, and getting involved with those. The Tank Association, Fleckhead Tank Association, still runs. It's still active. Is across the UK and across France. So you have a huge amount of the local French community, huge amount of UK community that are involved in these things. Because one of the key pieces of work that Philippe did and other people around the Tank project was they actually found the family members, the existing family members of the tank crews, many of whom had no idea that their relatives had ever been in World War One, let alone fought in a tank. And again, part of our role with that is that idea of being able to share and give those stories back to those people who perhaps didn't know it at all. As you go there, bringing them out to these places, sharing those stories, bringing them into these new communities, and those links I think are absolutely really key to it. So the image you can see down in the bottom right is the last part of the project really that we're involved in out on the site. Was actually getting the tank into its own museum. And again, that was a huge part of the sort of project. And again, our role in that was creating a lot of content material that was led by different people, because sometimes these things are built by committee. So the Tank Museum for the Combray tank is designed by the local kind of tourist board. It's designed by local people. And it has quite specific setups. It's quite specific ways they want things to go into there. but the community sometimes wants some slightly different things to go into there to tell the stories in slightly different ways. And Philippe in particular wanted things in slightly different ways. So we could work with that as a sort of bridge between these two sort of different areas. But again, it was capturing that whole moment from not from a news perspective. News crews were covering all these events, but they weren't sort of into the community. They were looking at the events themselves. What we wanted to do was go into the community and work with the people as they were seeing their tank move from the barn down to this sort of museum to essentially its final resting place. They moved it right next to the soldiers, so that this tank was again reburied. It's actually underground by quite a way. The tank now in its new museum, so we wanted to capture those stories as we go through. So we're finding different people in there as we go. And one of the sort of people that we captured, their story was the woman who lived in the house where Tank Deborah was destroyed. They rebuilt the house. So after the war, her family moved back in there. She's lived there ever since. And again, we talked to her. Her and her husband own that tank. Nobody else can claim ownership to that tank. It's theirs. It was destroyed outside their house. Again, they've been involved with it for this huge period of time. So capturing, telling their stories was really kind of key and important to what we were doing with these processes. And again, it was looking for those multiple different ways of kind of sharing information and sharing things, and sometimes things that were a little bit hidden. Quite interesting. Mentioned illustration at the before we started. Sort of here, someone just off their own back wrote a comic book about this entire story, and Philippe himself and his very famous Range Rover appear in this comic book. So we're sharing these stories in these multiple different ways. We looked a lot about where we wanted to take these things that people weren't doing as well. So a lot of things that people were already doing. The news was already covered. The newspapers were already covered, although we were creating a lot of content for them. A lot of our stuff has gone out on different channels. Forces TV, for example, takes a lot of this kind of stuff. But we also started to look very much at the kind of idea of schools and how schools can get involved with these things. A key part of it as well was, as we moved through COVID, we sort of shot a lot of this pre-COVID, and then we moved into COVID, and we looked at what can we do with the content, and how can we share this content, how can we share these histories, these stories with people in a lot of different ways. And we started to look at the idea of sort of remotely sharing a lot of these places and landscapes. So we moved a lot into the sort of virtual side as well as the traditional sort of news side, where a lot of the outputs went. So through this process, we started to visit schools. We started to talk to local schools and communities that were there. Just to sort of sum up on that bit, that's the sort of existing families of the tank crew that are there as well. So again, a huge disparate range of people that were in there. I've jumped ahead. I've done my own little time jump there. Another story that we found was Johan, and he built his own tank. So again, we have all these different ways of getting people involved, getting people interested. How's he doing it? He built his own full-size replica tank. That thing was terrifying. I had to stand right next to that as that was tearing up the road on the sort of anniversaries. This was all on the 100-year anniversary of the Battle of Cambrai. And another thing that we try and do, that Fiona and myself try and do, is we try and work a little bit outside of those anniversaries. As you expect, there's always a massive upsurge in interest of a lot of these stories around anniversary periods, but we actually think there's a lot of value in different aspects of these stories. With the tank in particular, we talk about the camaraderie of the crew. Well, that's a fascinating kind of subject of psychology in itself, outside of the idea of the history of the battle or any of those things. Yes, I did have to walk in front of that tank. Absolutely terrifying. So it's looking at those ideas of how we're sharing, how we're pulling these different bits of information in. So we thought schools was a sort of great way of sort of approaching this. In the UK, we've still got a lot of World War I actually in the curriculum. We've got a lot of that material there. But also in France, we wanted to, again, build that idea of those communities that exist across the two different areas, for sort of local school kids to understand what's in their community and how we have perhaps a different perception of the history and the spaces and places as well that we go and work in. So one of the things that we did when we were out there is we started doing talks in schools, and I am not a native French speaker, so that was quite a big challenge trying to explain sort of camera technology and things to school kids, but that was great fun sort of experience to try that. So it's this idea of sort of getting away from those traditional bits of research, the journal articles and those aspects, and getting out and sharing this directly with the people that we think matter the most, which is the public, the kids, the people who are interested in these areas. So again, we brought that back to UK schools as well. So we started this sort of process of what is it that kids actually want? You know, we can make assumptions about these things. What is it that they actually want? So we did talks about the sort of history of the tank, finding the tank. But what we actually found out and what was really interesting is that they're actually really interested in two other things, which is how do all these things work? How do all these things from history actually work? How did a tank work? I got asked that question so many times. Thankfully, I was a trained engineer, so I kind of had an idea, so I could talk to them about that. But also they wanted to know about how we created and made material and created content. So again, that started to build us up with this idea of we're not just going to talk about history, we're not historians. We're going to talk about how do we make this thing, how do we capture these things, how do we talk to people, how do we build all these ideas. And so we used to take the technology into the schools as well and share those materials and share those ideas with them throughout that project. Again, different ways that we took this, these sort of subjects out, and some different things that we took to share these different kind of components of the research is, again, we've taken it to traditional research sort of conferences. So we took it over to Belfast, which had some significant World War I research there. But again, we're still discovering things about the story. So as we were sitting there, we realised, well, one of the soldiers that was killed in the tank was actually from Ireland. So he was an Irish soldier. So we looked and we went, he's 5 miles down the road that this guy was born. He was really nearby. So again, those links started to build up. So again, we could start to talk to people in Belfast about this story. So now we build this other little community around those ideas. But again, one of the things that we still love is sharing these stories with kids. And you can see our little chap in the middle there with his uniform on. Absolutely fantastic set of events that we sort of took our work to, which was the science of the Great War. So again, it's this idea of shifting the perspective on how we're telling stories and what we're sort of putting in front of people. Another aspect of this that we talk about more in the sort of Hawthorne project that I'll come on to in a minute is the fact that this particular war was where a lot of photography and sort of film content was created. It was when film was first coming out. It was some of the first genuine footage of sort of battles was created at this time. So again, it gives us that idea of what's the science behind the thing that we're still doing now with cameras. So again, we built that into the sort of different outputs that we built through that. So again, great events, and really it's that activity. I think that's the one we love sharing with the sort of outputs we do, is getting actively involved with these different events. Dress up as a soldier, pretend to be in a tank. How can we make that work? And we actually left a lot of these kids with tasks to do. So a lot of the teachers got back in touch with us after we'd visited, and we given these tasks, and we said, get a box about this big and stick 4 of your pupils in it, because that's about how much room they had in a tank. So again, it's getting that actively involved with the sort of outputs there. So it keeps it exciting, keeps it interesting. After we've done a lot of the work on the tank project, I will say we are still working on the final output of the film for that. We have a sort of short version of the film that did a lot of the sort of museums. So we took that into the tank museum down in Bovington. So again, we're getting sort of outputs down there for that sort of contemporary work that was working through those things. So again, that kind of almost traditional output, but with the sort of different edge on the stories. We then got involved with this project in Hawthorne Crater, again another World War I project. It's the sort of start and the end of the Battle of the Somme, this particular site. And again, what was fascinating here with the community was a little bit different here to the community in Flequier in Combray, because they weren't quite so aware of the thing that was sat right on their doorstep. And this is something that we have to sort of factor into the way we work, and something we try and share with people, is that we might know and understand all these bits of history, all these places, all these things that happened through World War One, but actually the people who live here, they just want to farm. They just want to get out and sow the crops and grow and sort of live their lives. So the Hawthorne Crater was a huge mine explosion under the German trenches at the start of the Battle of the Somme, and at the end of the Battle of the Somme. It was blown up twice. But like I say, the community just want to farm. They just want to go out there and they want to sort of work in that area on the fields and on the farms. So through this project, the actual site of the Hawthorn Crater was really complicated because it was literally on the border of 4 different farmers' fields. So there had to be this process of negotiating with these farmers as like, well, it was looking at a sort of a restoration and preservation project from the main project point of view. And then again, from sort of Fiona and my point of view, from the production house point of view, it was about reinterpreting some of the original materials that were created at that point. It was about sharing the stories around that site. But what we looked at was making it accessible for people who can't get there. I think that became a really important part of the sort of projects as well, because some of these sites aren't always accessible to people. So what is it that we can do virtually through film, through audio, and as we start to do a lot more of now, sort of fully virtual projects using games technology, using visual effects technology to recreate things, how can we then make those accessible? So again, that shifts and changes and builds all the different outputs that we're working on. At the core of it, still going back to the start, Fiona is a storyteller. I do technical picture making type stuff. So that is a really good kind of collaboration that works between us. And then we work with all these different people who kind of contribute to these things. This was a kind of true multi-component project because it didn't just involve the sort of filmmaking side of things from us. It involved a huge range of different people, and this was a really interesting one in terms of the way that we got it supported. Is each individual area of work on this were kind of self-supporting, if you like. So we had to look at how we're going to support ourselves. And it's a real shame it's not there anymore, but we used Erasmus a lot for this through the kind of exchange program that Erasmus have got. So we worked that in a couple of different ways where we would go out and we would work with museums in the area. There's a museum right on the site here as well. We would work with those museums and sort of work in them for a little while, but we'd also do that with students. So we'd have students on longer term exchange programs through there as well. So they were essentially going out there and being like our sort of scoping out projects and working before we ever went out on our part of the project. So the community itself involved archaeologists, it involved us with the filmmaking side, it involved people who are just interested. I think this is always a fascinating thing. People just have an interest in this area. It involved sort of historians. Andy Robertshaw, military historian, was sort of heavily involved in this, and it involved the community. So we brought the community in, and what we would start to do is we'd start to show them the site, sometimes using pieces of technology. So one of the first visits we did, I took the drone up and we literally just flew it above the site, and we just got them to look at the screen because they'd never actually seen their own kind of site from above like that. They hadn't got the sort of idea of the scale or anything. You know, it was just an inconvenience to them, to be honest, in the field, is that they'd started to push material back into it because it was in their way as they were trying to do their farming. So again, we built up this awareness through this sort of project, which was really interesting. We took our students along with us, and that included forensic students as well, forensic science students. So again, a slightly different community that built around this. And we looked at it from this multi-component output. So what we started to do with this started to get more traditional sort of research outputs as well. Journal articles written, conferences sort of contributed to, that included all of these different people's stories that we put together. So there's a number of the people there that worked on it. So landowners, Stoke-on-Trent City Council were involved from the archaeology side, but we're also looking at chemistry. So how are we going to look at the sort of impact of World War I 100 years later? And it's fascinating, some of the finds, because as archaeologists would find a firing bay where a machine gun was set up, the chemists would be looking at the crop growth around those areas. And then we'd have both sort of my drone and then a sort of analytical drone looking at the chemical composition of the soil that was there as well. So we could create this incredibly detailed picture that we could build up around this. And again, the goal with these projects now, the sort of ongoing work that's going on, is that we can create a huge amount of material that is completely remotely accessible from anywhere in the world, that you can look at the sort of visual of the site, you can understand the layout of the site, but you also have those sort of multi-layered details of chemistry, of history, of movement of people through these different areas on the site as well. So really fascinating kind of outputs that can be created from that. And again, I think from the idea of the sort of practice-based research side of things, really key part of us again is bringing in the students, whether that's sharing these materials with the school kids and with our own sort of students that are coming in. It's getting them involved in the creation of these projects and building these projects for them so they can actually have these as proper outputs. So one of the things that we've worked on a lot over this last sort of period of time was getting visual effects students, as are here, to work on sort of content creation that can become essentially this sort of online virtual map. You know, my sort of goal with it really is that it's, I never like using the term game technology when we're talking about this type of history, Holocaust and war and things like that, but it's the truth of it is looking at real-time games technology to allow interactive experiences, augmented reality experiences, virtual reality experiences that schools can use and engage with to tell these sort of parts of history and these stories. So here, Andy Robertshaw, the military historian, brings along some of his fully authentic uniforms. What that means is our students can then digitally scan these elements of it. We can take digital scans of the site and materials that are there, and we can pull those in, and we can start to build these stories that people can engage with in slightly different ways. And interestingly, one of those parts of research that we mentioned with the Hawthorne crater in particular is, as I mentioned, it's some of the only original battle footage from that period of time. A huge amount of the footage that you see archived is actually reconstruction or recreation, close to battlefields, but not always real battle footage. Hawthorne Ridge had actual battle footage. Geoffrey Malins stood at the side of the battle, and you can see on the right-hand side there a 3D model of the camera that he used. Hand-cranked camera that he had to roll and roll and roll to get footage of this. And he got that mine explosion. It's one of the most famous pieces of World War I footage that was there. Apparently, he almost missed it because he nearly ran out of film as he was rolling his film through the camera. So it's amazing that we got that piece of footage. But what it allowed us to do when we went back there is we've now got technology where we can start to fine-tune what we know about these elements of the actual story. So, as I mentioned, the Hawthorne crater was blown up twice. So what we see from that original piece of footage, the first mine explosion, is only part of the story. And people had said, well, where are these people placed? Where is Geoffrey Malins placed? How's he getting this footage? And it was always a little bit wrong because we look at the mine explosion now and it's bigger than that first day explosion. So I've got a load of technology that I can use when we go out on site, and I can actually map the lens angle, have to go and find the exact lens, the exact format of film that was used, and we can now more precisely measure where people were stood on the day of the battle. That means that when we go into the virtual recreation, we can literally put people exactly where they were and recreate those scenes and recreate those elements, you know, as accurate as we possibly can. What I think is great about the real-time technology that we're starting to move into now is that means that we can tweak and shift and change it. If I go out and I film, as we did, the exact spot 100 years later where that mine crater went off, if my framing is off or if my positioning is off, that's it. I've committed it to film and it will stay like that, and I'll have to tell people that I got it wrong on that day. With the real-time technology now, we can adjust it and we can shift and we can adapt and change and put new information into it as that information occurs. Because that's what's fascinating to me as well. We're still finding out new things about this stuff that happened, you know, well over 100 years ago now. So I think, again, those are really interesting kind of outputs that we look at as we work through with these projects. So some of the traditional kind of outputs that we've done are available on those links. I'm assuming Agatha is going to make these available online. That's another thing.
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes, if someone wants them, just get in touch with me and I can share that. Yes.
Absolutely. Cool. So yeah, we've got a couple of the short version of what we call the friend making machine, which kind of gives the overview of the sort of Tank Deborah story and all these people that we've mentioned, these different communities, these different aspects that we've mentioned. We have Johann's Tank little film, which again was shot on the sort of 100-year anniversary of that. But again, we're trying to look now at how do we keep these things going for a period of time after that real interest in the anniversary periods is there. And then a few kind of write-ups on the various projects that are there as well. Some of the outputs from Hawthorne Crater, And again, the ongoing work, as you say, is these kind of virtual reproductions of these historical events, and kind of creating a format and a way of creating those is a lot of the work that's there. And that, as I think, what I really enjoy about that is getting the students sort of involved in those sort of real world projects and to sort of tell those. So yeah, that's a kind of overview of Tank Deborah. Some of the things that we've kind of created and done through that. Like I say, the links are there and available to look through. Huge amount of other stuff that's sort of available on these stories, and sort of all the other outputs that we've been involved with, as well as sort of linked to these across the Holocaust project, Tank project, and Hawthorne Crater to work through those. So cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. Amazing. So again, I'm going to open for questions from the audience in a second, but if you don't mind, I'm just going to ask some questions at the beginning. And I really love what you and Fiona do, which is probably not a surprise to you because we talk about it quite often. But I think what this specific talk is particularly interesting. The reason why it's so interesting is because many people coming to creative practice research in academia are like people like yourself and Fiona, so people coming from really strong creative background, years and years of experience, and suddenly you find yourself in this context of academia where you have to think about other things, when you have to think about impact, which is something that you do very well here, and I'll get back to that, and outputs and potentially publications and things like that. So because the seminar is obviously dedicated in the first instance for anyone who's willing to move into practice research, what do you think was the most important or kind of significant learning for you and Fiona in this journey? So, you know, with your strong practice backgrounds, when you started working in this kind of academic context, what was the biggest learning, or what kind of advice can you give to people like yourself?
Yeah, that's a really tricky one. I think the big challenge that we always had right from the start was the sort of academic language and the traditional kind of research outputs. I think what we got a lot as we sort of started through this process was, when are you writing the article? When you're writing the journal article, where's it going to be published? Where's the article going to be published? And as practitioners, we're making films, and we're doing conferences, and we're going to schools and talking, and we're doing all of these different outputs, which to us are the thing of value. That's what we think is the kind of valuable thing. So yeah, that was probably the biggest kind of learning experience of how do we make this fit the format of academic research. And I think what's interesting now is that's starting to come through now is I think the other way around is that process of academic research is changing, actually, I think, to potentially fit more to what we were doing at the start. So we had to look at it in terms very much of, like I say, impact, I think, is probably one of the most important things. So what are we going to do? It's not going to be in a history journal. That's not where this work is going to go. It doesn't suit it, doesn't sort of fit that. So for us, it's impact. It's how are we getting this out there with the conferences, with the schools, with all these different outputs that are in there. How do we then sort of turn that into value for research? So it's looking at the impact. It's looking then at the portfolio. So it's how does all this work link? Because again, as you may have picked up from there, what happens with magpies is basically, where's a shiny thing? Let's go and look at the shiny, interesting thing over there. And then again, something interesting happens over this side. So we're now looking at the interesting thing over here. So it's that idea of how do we build all these things, link them all together, turn it into a portfolio? How do we then go through, and it's things like the 300-word statements, which they should be easier to write, but they are incredibly hard to actually write those and to get that idea of the rigor and the sort of process of research into those through this. So yeah, really it's kind of pushed towards the impact side of things and the sort of process that goes into it, which was one of the biggest things we had to kind of learn.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. And I will go back to Rev and impact in a second. But if you don't mind, I'm just going to ask another question to do, because I love what you said, that you, with the project, you went there without any plan, and it was a discovery, and I just really love it. And when I try to think about strategies, hoping to build for people working with creative practice research, I always feel that the biggest challenge, or one of them, is how to manage this academic rigor with inevitably creative chaos, which we really need when we work with this idea of doing something creative. It is a discovery, it is chaotic, and sometimes your plan is just really has some start and end point, but you don't really have anything in between. So do you mind telling us a little bit about how you manage this? Because I mean, it really resonates with me, and I don't think there's anyone working with creative practice who doesn't feel these moments of, it's chaotic, I don't know what I'm doing, but I know that I'm gonna get there at the end. So how do you manage this in academic context again? Because obviously you have to deliver something, and it's always the case, because even when you make a regular film, if you like, you do have your deadlines, you do have to deliver as well. But I think in terms of academia, it's the pressure is even higher, because you still need to think about this criteria you will be judged by, so the rigor and so on and so forth.
I think sometimes you kind of try and separate the two things a little bit. So it's almost like the creative practice becomes functional for something else. So what we might actually be looking at here is actually, how do communities work? That might be a sort of research question. And it just so happens that we're going to go there and make a load of films and discover it to figure that part of it out. I think it's about not being afraid to not have a plan is a key part of it. Some people I know are terrified of not having a kind of idea of where they're going and what they're creating. And I think with creative practice in particular, if in projects like this, if you go in with a detailed plan, you're just going to make too much stuff. That's the problem, and you're going to disengage, I think, with the audience. So it's almost like saying, the plan, the bit where we're going to have the rigor, is how do we work with the community?
Yeah.
Forget what the output is, forget any aspect of that. That's other things that are happening. So that's where that stuff has to sit. But then it's thinking, as the final part of it, who is it for? So if we get those two things, those are like your bookends that help us build that kind of rigor. So that's where we're rigorous on things.
Yeah.
So we have principles when we go in and work with people. And I think a lot of that the experience of that probably comes from working in a lot of crime and a lot of difficult subjects. So you have to work with people in slightly different ways through that. So that's where probably the rigor sits, is how are we working with people?
Yeah.
Everything else is secondary until we think about the point of where the audience is and where these things are actually going. But again, we're sort of flexible on those. Is like I say, we're traditional filmmakers, but we're also doing podcasts, and we're also doing virtual content, and we're also doing all these different things. The thing we have to kind of balance is not trying to do too many ideas. We abandoned one quite significantly on the Hawthorne project, which was 3 days of live broadcasting from the middle of remote France. And we did all the work on it and we got everything figured out, but we just went, it's too much, and we're not going to be able to have the rigor in there. That's not actually going to be research at all. It's not going to fit into that, because we're not going to get that community discussion thing going with it. It's not going to work for that. So again, sometimes it's what do we drop and sort of get rid of. And I'll say that again, it's something that happened with the tank documentary. Is we put together 30-40 minutes of it, and we both looked at each other and went, everything we've done here is wrong, because we've gone away from those sort of original principles. So again, it's that idea of occasionally reminding yourself of what it was you were doing. Yeah. It's the community. This is what we're looking at. We're looking at the community. We're not looking at we don't actually want to know the history of the tank. Other people are doing that. You can throw people into other bits of work to look at that. The community has to come back into it all the time. So it's putting those reminders in for yourself as well, I think.
And I have so many questions. I kind of want to, this is a moment when I want to both continue with my questions and open it to the public, because I know that I'm sure that Francisco, my PhD student who is in the audience, I know you probably related to this moment when Paul said, well, it's this idea about getting comfortable with not having a plan. So I hope you don't mind sharing, Francisco, that at the beginning of your journey, Francisco is working on the project on sonic landscape of a documentary form. So he's working on a storytelling in nonfiction through sound rather than the primacy of image, really. And at the beginning, the conversations we were having was, well, how do I do it? And I was, well, I don't know, figure it out. And that was exactly what you're talking about, Paul. And
I absolutely think it is. I absolutely think it is. And I think if you go in with too much of a plan, you might miss the moment of discovery. you might completely miss a moment of discovery because you think, well, it has to be like this. I have to make my film like this. I have to create like this. I have to do this.
Yeah.
But actually, the thing you need to find is sitting there, like waiting for you to discover it.
Absolutely. So I think Simon, if you don't mind asking, thank you for being here today. If you want to ask your question, and then I'm gonna read the questions from the chat.
Yeah, thanks so much, Agata. It's Paul. That great talk. I just wanted to know, when you're when you are considering the academic outputs, what I was wondering was, did you find a place to, in inverted commas, publish or actually get them out, that you could include a lot of the audiovisual material in the actual publication stroke output? I just was wanting to know what your thoughts were on that. You know, it's been quite a few different models of that stuff tried, and I don't know what your thoughts were. Or did you just think the research stuff was text, or did you manage to include a lot of the audiovisual?
Yeah, I mean, that is a big kind of challenge, and it's why we kind of focused on sort of sharing through conference and sharing through talks and things like that, because we can work those things in our own way in those. A lot of the ones that we kind of built up through that, I know some are like really limited in time, so you get 10 minutes or 15 minutes. So we kind of pushed for the longer talks where we could get all this material in and we could show the film, we could show the audiovisual stuff. But one of the things that we do with it is part of the sort of multi-component part of it is we have many different versions of the same thing. So we do a lot of very short versions of the content that we put in there. A lot of the what you call the kind of traditional sort of outputs, you won't be able to get that really sort of rich set of different media in there. So again, one of the things we're looking at, I can't remember exactly whose talk it was in one of these seminar series, but it's the self-publishing sort of process as well. So it's that idea of almost sort of journaling the sort of process and sort of self-publishing these things. So you're outputting a lot of the content as it's happening, and we tried a lot of that through the Hawthorne project. So as we were doing something, it was stressful because then I was editing it and then putting it out a couple of days later, and a lot of that tended to be through our own kind of university blogs and things like that, as those sort of processes. So really that again, that's a work in progress for us, is how do we get, you know, the accepted outputs or the accepted places to put this work, but still maintain all these different bits of media. And I think what's quite interesting now, I think, with some of the stuff that's coming out about the next ref, is it feels like they're looking more at what you do. And I think that might change the way things get published a lot in the next round.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think you're right. It's good for practice-based research. I did note on one reading of the ref was that an impact case study will be worth 10 times cash terms an output, a text-based output. So
yeah,
roll on ref 2020.
Okay, absolutely. I think the direction it's going
promising
will suit this stuff a lot more. I think.
Thank you so much, Simon. I don't
Thank you.
but here for me. So I'm gonna read a question from the chat, if that's okay. So Professor Mai Salim says, thanks Paul for an interesting presentation. How did the community gain control/ownership in the production process, and what theoretical models did you find helpful? What theoretical models did you find helpful?
Cool. So the theoretical bit, probably Fiona's bit more than my bit, but in terms of that control and ownership, what we did is we maintained conversation with these communities a lot, and what we did is we made sure that we didn't just show them a finished piece of work and say, this is your story. Is what we would do, bring them in progress, and this is when we formalized it quite a bit more, probably on the Hawthorne project. With the tank project, because we'd known a lot of these people for a long period of time, it was a slightly different experience. So we already knew Jacques, the local archivist, and we already knew Philippe, and we already knew the mayor, and we already knew these people. So there was a trust built there. So I think that trust was a key part of getting that sort of control and ownership. They trusted us with what we were doing, and we'd share it with them. With Hawthorne, what we did is we quite specifically set up a sort of town hall meeting after we went there 3 times. So after the first time, we'd got the sort of initial scoping and we'd done some initial work on it. And then we came back the second time. One of the first things we did was we did a town hall meeting with the community, everybody invited, wine and snacks and all this sort of stuff in there. And we just had this sort of open discussion with them about what we'd got at this point, sort of a third of the way through what we were doing, that we could then continue that story. And what that meant then was that each different individual kind of researcher or contributor to that could then have those discussions of interest with each part of the community. So you'd have people who lived in houses that still had a bunker underneath, and they'd go and talk to the archaeologist and historian about that. People who are interested in the tech, they'd come to talk to us about the sort of filmmaking side of things. So it was building that trust. And again, it's our awareness that gets tested, because one of the things that we did in that town hall meeting, which is a big mistake, is we went off and we bought wine from the local supermarket, and we thought, we don't know if there's any facilities here or glasses or anything like that. So we bought a load of plastic cups. Do not serve wine to French people in plastic cups. They do not appreciate that. So yeah, the sort of local mayor's wife went off and got a load of glasses from her house and brought it in. But I think those kind of experiences help the community with that ownership of the project. Is they're teaching us as well, and we're sharing our stuff with them. We're not going on in and we never imposed anything on them. We listened. I think a lot of it as well is listening to them through those sort of processes.
Great one. Thank you, Paul. So then we have a question from Andy. Fantastic talk. Thank you. Yeah. Is this the comic you mentioned? And there's a link. I don't really want to open it right now. Is that the one?
That's the one, yeah, called The Last Brady, and it's been translated into loads of different languages, and thankfully it's on Amazon now. That's really good to see that it's sort of got that outreach, because when we went over there, it was literally being sold in a little individual museum shop in France. I don't know if anyone who's ever been to the sort of the battlefields in France. Is a load of the locals have their own little museum that is not advertised anywhere. You only know about it if you walk past it and go, is that a museum? And then the homeowner will let you into their garage usually and show you their mini museum. So yeah, we found a copy from there, and it's fascinating stuff, because we know Philippe, and it's quite funny because it's got him and his Range Rover in there, and his Range Rover is a key part of the story as well, because generally what happens if you visit Philippe in France and you go to his hotel and you tell him that you're interested in the battlefields of the tank, he will then take you out for the next 4 hours in his Range Rover and drive you across fields. And no word of a lie, on one of these trips, he stopped in the middle of the field, he got out, he picked something up from the ground, put it on the passenger seat, got back in and drove off. I looked over to the passenger seat and it was a bomb. So yeah, that was interesting.
Oh, okay. That's quite a story, isn't it?
It's an adventure every time you go there.
It sounds like it. So this is a really good question from Freya, who I think has dropped from the meeting right now, but I will be in touch with her after, so I will get back to her, and obviously this is recorded. So she says, thanks for this, but how do you then get people on board when you do have to present your proposal without being able to give funders, etc., the confidence that something will be the result in the end? Which is easier for established researchers, but if you are just starting out, thanks, Agatha, for organizing. Oh, yes. So that's a good question, because obviously it links to this idea of...
That is an outstanding question, and I think the answer for that is probably going to be different depending on your field of work. I think there's going to be a little bit of kind of looking into different funding aspects for it. And what we had to do with a lot of these is we had to find alternative ways of getting ourselves kind of funded, because it's that initial interest which is the hard part to do. This is where Erasmus came in and was really valuable to us. So as I mentioned, the very first one was a high funded project, which was looking at that idea of linking broadcast researchers for outputs. So that was many years ago now. It was about 10 years ago, I think that was. So that funding came in, and the project was built around that. But that one was slightly different because some of the outputs had that traditional work in there. So the archaeology part of that work had traditional outputs. And I think this is one of the things we do is we look at who is it that we can collaborate with that is going to have a traditional output as well as our work, so we can piggyback off the back of these different aspects of research. That was a key part of what the high funding was about actually trying to do. And so we look at it and we go with Hawthorne, for example. That one came about because we had chemists, we had historians, we had archaeologists, we had preservation people there. We had this massive amount of other component research that was going to come out from this. So there are a massive amount of sort of traditional journal articles on the chemistry of World War One, on the impact on modern farming in that region. So there's a lot of those outputs that work with that. And then we sort of piggyback off that funding. And what we do is we look at how we can support that with different ways in ourselves. And sometimes that's about giving something back. So the Erasmus funding that we got at that period was about giving something back. So what it meant is that we say we had to go and work. We love going and working with the local museums. That was part of what we had to do as a kind of add-on to the research work we did. So what Erasmus then paid for was all of our travel, our sustenance, those aspects of it. What that allows us to do then is it allows us almost to create, if you're talking broadcast and film terms, the pitch tape. So that becomes the sort of thing that we can then take to traditional funders and show them that there is an output. There is something coming out of this from our point of view as well. And again, it's through some of these conferences, we've got some interest from AHRC now on the project and sort of how to work with these. So it's a long road. That's many years of trying to get these things up, but yeah, people like AHRC that were at some of these conferences, you talk to those people, they now see the output, and that brings that sort of back in. With the very start of the tank project, like I said, it didn't have that plan at the start. We just exploited the fact that we were traveling across France and we had a load of film kit with us, so we'd already been funded to be there. And we didn't mind spending, a day or two getting some extra stuff. So it's about finding things that aren't always traditional funding that sort of pull these things back through into it. So Erasmus was great for us. We need to find something that replaces what Erasmus did in those sort of setups. The mobility and the internships and those things in Erasmus, outside of the kind of the sort of the undergraduate taught things that Erasmus does, they were brilliant. They were really good for the work that we did, because beyond sort of accommodation and food, we didn't really have much of a sort of expense that we needed to put into these things.
So Freya, just to let you know, your question has been just answered when you were away, so hopefully you can catch up with this from the recording, but it was a really interesting answer from Paul. So I think this is a moment when I can... Oh, Francisco, go ahead.
Hi. Sorry, Agatha, you have time?
Of course.
Yeah, okay. No, thank you, Paul. Wonderful. It's really interesting, complex project in some ways. My question is curiosity. How long did it take, the framework of this project? Is still going on or it's concluded now?
Yeah, so the way that we've kind of approached all these different bits of work is we see it like this sort of umbrella. So if I put everything back into kind of order, many years ago, Fiona and I met, and the first project that became the sort of production house umbrella was the Holocaust project, the high funded project. So that was about 10 years ago now. That then led into the sort of tank project. So that was over a period of about 2 or 3 years that we were going backwards and forwards working on that. And the Hawthorne project came off the back of that. That was probably 1.5 years that we spent on the Hawthorne project in terms of actually going out there and sort of working in the space and in the environment. But the Hawthorne one in particular is still ongoing. So because COVID basically put a big pause on what we were doing, but it also helps us to sort of build on that idea of making these projects virtual and sort of having this idea of being able to go to a site or discover these places without having to physically go there. So yeah, we started up again in September last year with the sort of virtual side of it. So that's been ongoing with the students, and that's something we're going to work on, sort of continuously now. So it's that idea of, hopefully within the next year we'll have that as an output. but that umbrella, that production house, that will just continue. So it'll carry on.
Ongoing project, yeah. Wow.
Okay.
Yeah, just sorry, one more question related, not related to that, but I'm very curious, just to clarify, because it's a very multidisciplinary research, and there's a lot of crossing from scientific archaeologists, restoration, and history in terms of archive, and of course, a more like qualitative, more creative storytelling, and so it means that in terms of outputs. And I understand that the focus, the community, local community, that's the impact really plays there. But there was also, how is the negotiation, the tension between the scientific in terms of, in the end of the day, you must publish articles or not? Or you decide, no, we're not going to move towards this academic, scientific part of the project, and we're going to, yeah, I'm interested in this tension because it sounds very, very complicated to move around.
Yeah, it definitely is, and I think it's the key one is always that ownership of the bit of the project. I think that's always a sort of important part of it, and right from the start, Hawthorne probably is the one where that was most significant. And what we did is that each individual kind of area had their own kind of goals, their own things that they were looking for, and they would publish independently themselves once their work had been completed, because we couldn't impose a timeline on sort of the chemistry, for example, because that requires samples taken on site and then lab work afterwards, whereas the archaeology, that is a significant part of that is done on site. And then, because with that particular one, there wasn't a lot of material being taken away from the site. It was very much the sort of spaces that were there at the time. So the archaeology can potentially publish earlier than the chemistry. But while they're on site, is those things interrelate 100%. So it would be a case of end of the day meetings and saying, okay, well, we found a firing bay. So it would be really good if the sort of chemistry team would look in this area, because that's where all the stuff's going to happen. So, you know, on site, those things were shifting and changing sort of on a daily basis. But once it became, you know, the outputs from those people, that was dictated by those individual teams. Some of it, again, we collaborated with Kiel a bit on parts of this as well, because they came out and sort of did some of the site survey work that we were doing there. So basically, we waited until they were ready with some of our material. Some of our material would be put out, and some of it, when we looked at it, that team would say, do you know what, it'd be great if you didn't put that little bit of information out because we haven't confirmed it yet. And it's the classic danger of whenever we're recording stuff on site, is that immediate reaction to something could be very different to what we actually find out is the best truth we can get to, you know, months later once we've looked at all that data. So sometimes someone would say, do you know what, just hold that bit of information for a little period of time. So again, it was just that sort of sharing and working together.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
So if you don't mind, Paul, I just wanted to go back to this idea of impact, because obviously it was so rich in impact on communities in terms of what you've done, and layers and types of different communities in so many different places. It really is impressive, and actually that's something which I think not many people realize sometimes, because you might say, all right, we're just making a film about a tank. What kind of impact can a film like that have? And obviously it has an incredible potential to do this. So I was wondering, at what point were you actually identifying and thinking about all these communities and schools and different places? I know that some of them you've mentioned happened at some point later in the project, but was it at the very beginning of the project when you started working that you already started kind of drafting the ideas of what kind of communities you can work with and what kind of impact it can have on the younger communities, the younger generations, and so on and so forth? Or has it happened afterwards?
I think it depends very much on the project. I think is the way that it works. So, for example, with the Holocaust project, we went into that knowing a very limited number of the people that were involved. There was already established relationships for years and years within that sort of research community, and we came in very kind of new and fresh to that. So yeah, we had to discover those communities as we went. And I think this is where the sort of practice experience comes in a little bit across what we do. And it's recognizing when something is about to happen that you need to go and get. That happens a lot. One story that I had from the Holocaust Project was we found out that someone was visiting this site where the house was being repatriated into the family in Oswiecim, which is Auschwitz, the town. And from our point of view, from a filmmaking point of view, we have to get this. But other people were just like, oh, we'll go and have a chat to him. A very casual kind of way of doing it. And I ran down a flight of steps, turning my camera on and getting all my stuff ready. And I ran into an interview because they'd already started. So again, sometimes those things are that immediate. It's right in the moment like that. Whereas the France project with the tank, for example, we had a much longer lead-in time. So we already knew a lot of the key people that were in there. And from that point of view then on, and this is why we talk about the work is actually about communities and about collaboration rather than the tank or the thing or the crater. That's the key skill we try and find, which is how does that person link to that person? How do they know that person? What is it that we're going to get by talking to these people? What are the links? Recognizing, I think, links between different people that end up in a place, for example. So, these projects are great because you have a central hub, which was Philippe's hotel. So that became a key part of it. And I think if you look for those things in the projects you do, look for the place that people are or the thing that people go and talk about, and that will help you to kind of figure out what those groups and what those communities actually are. And be observant. You just observe people, look around the room and see, who's talking to who's involved, who's got this, and also who's quiet, who's sitting in a corner quietly, because they might have loads of stuff that you can discover.
Yeah, so it looks like it's also relating to what we were talking about before, like really keeping your eyes open, not having necessarily everything pre-planned and just having this open mind. But I wanted to ask you, because obviously, since we're talking about academic context for all of this, and even in your title, you did mention REF, and obviously there's one thing to create an impact, but the other thing is to, again, frame it for REF case studies and just kind of in this, again, academic context. Did you find it difficult in a way in terms of obviously collecting all the evidence from real life impact, but also then translating that into a case study afterwards? Or do you think it was actually a very natural process? Because obviously this is again what we were talking about before. It's like you're doing your research, you're doing your practice, but suddenly you have to present it in this very strictly defined academic context at some point.
I think, yeah, with these sort of things, it's looking at the sort of two aspects. Is what you end up having to do with the portfolio side of things is you have to kind of say what those links are. You have to be quite specific about what those links are, and the sort of statements that come with it define all of that sort of aspect for you. So it's almost like you're writing a comprehension of what your own work is. And again, that was a significant part of Fiona's input into the sort of REF side of things, was having to figure out what to put in and what to keep out, because that was also another really important part of it, is which bits of the work that we think are amazing are we having to take out of this because they don't fit that sort of clear narrative of what this sort of work and what this research is. And so it's pulling those things in. And a lot of the time with these, this is the difficulty sometimes of this idea of not having the plan, is where you retrospectively then have to go back to people that you've already got these sort of long-term working relationships with, and you sort of then go back to those experiences with them, and they write those kind of bits of evidence, those bits of justification for you. So again, with the tank project, it was Philippe, it was the tank regiment itself. So they came in and sort of explained the sort of process and impact on them. The families that we talked to as well. We talked to Tippings and Heaps. We'd done a lot of work with them. So it's going back to them sort of after that sort of process. Again, if you were doing it that other way around, where you planned this research, you would have done that beforehand and you would have that. So that would exist. But because it was this voyage of discovery, and it's like, oh, that's a family member of the tank, we need to get them now.
Yes.
You build that relationship with them so you can then go back at that later stage and pull back that evidence that you need to justify it as a sort of ref output.
I think what's really also extremely impressive about your project, and I think this links to Francisco's question, is how complex it is in terms of the number of collaborators you have, the number of disciplines involved. But Freya, to your question, really, the kind of the ability to combine different types of funding as well, which might be the way to manage this kind of big project. So it's almost like you said, this kind of umbrella of multiple micro projects, or maybe not so micro. But I think this is really what we very often do, and in some cases it's just the way it works. One project leads to another, and then only afterwards you realize that this is the same project. Obviously, in this case, it's a more complex entity.
It is, and I think that one of the big things that I don't want to say we have to overcome, because we don't want to overcome it, which is impatience, which is we don't always have the patience in that traditional idea of getting funding for a piece of research, because again, as practitioners, we're sitting there thinking, why am I waiting to get funding? Why am I doing all this work to get to the point where you tell me I can have funding? I could have done the project by that point. I could have got most of the way through it by that point. So it is that idea, and I understand it. You know, the people who are putting the funding out there, they need to know that the project is going to have that outcome. There we are, sort of waving our bit of paper. Look how cool this is. Look how cool our project is. Why don't you want to fund our project? And this is where I think the value comes in with some of the sort of conferences that we go to and some of the conversations we have, is if we can go and talk directly to the funding organisers from the HRC or whoever else can be sort of funding our project, that is the advantage to us, because if they only ever get a form filled out by us that goes into one of their funding schemes, they don't really know us or really know the project. I think that's the difficult bit, and that's why we like the visual things. We like these artifacts, these things we create, because you can sit down with someone and you can show it and you can talk about it. I mean, I actually built a scale model of tank Deborah and took it with me to a conference, and it had a little motor in it and it ran across the desk, because that means now someone's going to remember that. Again, it's how we deal with people. So the people are more important, I think, than the forms we fill out. It's a real challenge, though, and it is. But that impatience is the biggest thing we have to get over, because I want to go and do the project. I don't want to write a bid. I want to go and do the project.
A great one. For everyone else who doesn't know Paul, this is the kind of thing Paul would do. So building a tank suddenly and just taking to a conference. Right. So I think I could not stress it more that this talk and the project you talked about today is just one of the most amazing examples of how complex and really difficult and really accomplished practice research can be. And it's really great argument, because we often feel like this morning I was in a seminar, a really nice colloquium about practice research, and the conversation was around these lines that we still being somehow treated as someone who doesn't really do serious research. And this argument is that the example you gave us today is like what we do is actually incredibly complex, because not only you're managing multiple disciplines, at least in terms of coordinating it, you speak to people who speak different languages effectively, not only literary, but also in terms of disciplines, because obviously each discipline has its own rules. You managing different types of funding at the same time, you managing both traditional elements and very complicated sometimes practice, which again, if you just were to talk about filmmaking, there's so many components and elements you need to take care of. It's not just, oh, I'm going to make a film. Obviously, there's lots of things you have to think about. So I think it's a fantastic argument, to bring understanding and more recognition and some kind of respect to what we do, because it's incredibly complicated. And I really argue it's much more complicated than, and this is not to say that traditional research is easy. Of course, it's not. But in terms of managing the different aspects, you really have to have your head in so many different places. So fantastic example, really. And we have a comment from Freya who says, so true, because we want to create beyond words, and we have to, but we have to then translate it back using words. Exactly that. It's quite interesting.
It's the sort of language, and I think something popped up on, I'll have to look it up again for the exact quote, but it popped up on LinkedIn, I think it was this morning, and it was about, even when we do the words bit, is making that bit accessible. It's like, who are we doing it for? If we're overcomplicating the language that we use to describe things, we're gatekeeping it, really, then, and that becomes a problem. So yeah.
Yeah, for everyone else, this is upcoming. This is a little sneaky peek into a mini project, an article. I'm actually collaborating with Paul and Francisco here. So this is about challenging this primacy of written word in academia. So there's going to be an article and hopefully an exhibition, but more about it when we have it out. So I think it's a good moment to kind of wrap it up. I think Simon has a final comment or question.
No, I was just putting my thumbs up.
Oh,
Good for you.
sorry.
I look forward to reading it.
Yeah, I hope it's going to be an interesting one. I very much hope so. So does anyone else have any final comment or final question before we wrap it up for today? I think we're all good. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Paul. It was really lovely, and thank you so much to Fiona, who is, even though she's not with us
in spirit,
part of this in a massive way. So thank you so much, everyone. So that was the very last seminar series for this academic year. We'll resume in October. I'm almost done with the program for the next year. There's going to be lots of interesting things. There's going to be people from different disciplines. We will have, well, I shouldn't put names here, but we will be talking about publications and all kind of practice research publications, venues and things like that. We'll be talking about different ways. We will still have some filmmakers, so hopefully it's going to be an equally interesting one. But for now, just thank you so much. I wish you all not only a good evening, good rest of the week, but good summer, and hopefully a restful one if you can afford it. And once again, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Paul.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Agatha, as well, for organizing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Maggie.
Bye, everyone.